Hey Internet, today we're going to be talking about hard drives. As you can see, I have a couple of different types of hard drives out in front of me, and we're going to be talking about, well, obviously, what do they look like? Why they're called hard drives, and the most important question, how do they work? How do they store that data? And no, magic is not a valid answer. Maybe at Hogwarts it is, but in the real world, there's actual science behind this. So, let's begin. As you can see, I have three different types of hard drives out in front of me. We have ancient dinosaur hard drive. We have a hard drive you'll probably end up finding in a desktop. And we have one you'll probably end up finding in a laptop. We won't be covering SSDs because they're not hard drives or hard disk drives. There's something different. Maybe we'll have another video about them, something else. But remember, hard drives and SSDs are two different things. So now that we know what they look like, how do they talk to the motherboard? So how does the data go to and from the hard drives? Well, again, there's different types. Some are older, some are newer. So starting with our dinosaur hard drive from the 1980s, you can see this one actually has two connectors, one here and one there, and I don't exactly know what they're called, but I know you only really see these in really, really old computers, mainly from the 80s. And to power it, they have a getting that into focus, they have a 4-pin Molex connector. And you can see that's why they call it 4 pins, because there's 4 pins in there. Moving on to our desktop hard drive. This one's a bit of an older one. But as you can see, just like the 1980s hard drive, the 4-pin Molex connector is here. You also, for power, and also you have what they called parallel ATA connector, which is this multi-pin thing here. So this giant slot here is basically where what they call the ribbon cable plugs in, and then that would plug into the motherboard. So that's how the data is transferred for a PATA or parallel ATA drive, which is this giant connector here. Now, moving on to the laptop drive, this one's is what they call SATA. So here's your power, and here's the SATA connector. So this is how the data goes from this hard drive to the motherboard. And it's SATA, and it's also, the more technical term is serial ATA. Now, not this dinosaur one here, these you only see with those weird two funky connectors, but these desktop and laptop hard drives, both of these, depending on the age, will either come with parallel ATA, PATA, or serial ATA, SATA. So PATA's a little bit on the older side. So older desktop and desktop hard drives and laptop hard drives will come with PATA. Newer ones will both come with SATA. So now that we know a little more about hard drives, like how they work, how they connect to the computer, and how the data is sent from them to the motherboard by these cables here, I don't have the actual cables, but by these slots here that the cables plug into, how about we answer the most important question, how they work? So let's start with our 1980s hard drive here. Now this particular hard drive is an ST225, and if you have any old computer that's been sitting up in your attic for 20, 30 years, it's probably going to either have an ST225 or an ST2 or at least something from the ST200 series. Now, the other thing I will say is, before you open it, make sure that if you do decide to open up a hard drive, make sure that it's broken and there's nothing valuable on it, because as soon as you open up the hard drive, you will destroy all the data on it. All the hard drives I'm going to show you are old and broken and do not work anymore. But as you can see here, they even give you a warning about not only handling it with care, but if you remove, the label, or you open up the drive, it will basically wreck the insides, and then the warranty will be void, so on and so forth. So basically, unless if the drive is completely dead, or, and it can't store data and it doesn't work, don't open it. And if you do decide to open up a good hard drive, I won't be held responsible. I warned you. So, let's open up this broken ancient hard drive. And as you can see, there's a motor with a little, I guess you could call that like a spindle-like thing. You have this arm here that's connected to this other arm that has these wire-looking things. Now, these are called the hard drive arms and the hard drive head. And if you look down this... It's going to be a little dark, but if you notice, there's a couple more underneath these metal-looking disc things, and these are called the platters. This is where your actual data is stored. And kind of as you notice, they're hard metal platters. And that's where the name hard disk drive comes from, or hard drive or hard disk, depending on how you coin it. Now, and that's basically where the name comes from, the hard metal disks where the data is stored. Now, fun little quick fact, we'll just throw it in there. Most people nowadays call it a hard drive. And you can also call it a hard disk. The actual term is a hard disk drive, or HDD. Now, where did the name hard disk come from? Now, we know that it's a hard disk drive. That's the technical term, because there's hard disks. Now, or I should say, where did the nickname hard disk come from? Well, back in the 80s when hard drives were coming out, and yes, don't worry, we're not going to be stuck in the 80s. We'll eventually get to the newer stuff. But for now, back in the 80s, when hard drives were coming out, you had two main ways to store data on a home computer. You had your removable media, or your floppy drive, or floppy disk. And you can see they're actually really flexible. You can bend them, and not bend them too much because you'll wreck them, but putting this back in the thing. And you had a floppy disk and you had a hard disk. So everybody referred them to as the floppy disk for the removable, and the hard disk for the internal storage that couldn't be removed, your non-removable storage. And you would also see them labeled as FDD for floppy disk drive, for removable floppy storage. And you had this was labeled HDD, hard disk drive, for the hard disks that had data on them that was non-removable, because this whole unit was mounted inside your computer and attached. So that's kind of where it comes from. Floppy disk, hard disk. But, since, we've come a long way since the 1980s, now we have CD-ROMs and zip disks and flash drives. No one really calls it a hard disk anymore, even though people know what you're talking about, because its counterpart, the floppy disk, really isn't around. So we just call it a hard disk. I'm sorry, hard drive. Hard drive. So, kind of, since we're on the moving on end of things, how about we bring down its modern counterparts and slide the board underneath there. And as you can notice, as we compare them, not too much has changed. The only difference is how much they can hold, because this wonderful hard drive here holds about 20 megabytes. And in back then that was a fair amount of data for the mid-80s. Nowadays that's completely nothing when hard drives hold hundreds of thousands of megabytes of data. Even newer drives hold, even newer and more expensive drives hold millions of megabytes. So 20 megs is nothing. But as you can see, now granted there's been some changes, like the spindle tier has been replaced by magnets, and the platters are made of out of the newer ones are made out of a different material, but the generally same principles and ideas are the same. But some of the mechanisms are the same. Now, if we take a look at the platters, even though they're made of slightly different materials, especially this older one here, they both spin. And while they spin, they have an arm here. Now, granted, the arm gets a lot smaller, but as it's spinning, the arm moves back and forth and reads the data. You can even see on this little guy here, pops out and can swivel back and forth. But when it comes to the mechanism part, the main difference is the fact that these two use magnets, one right here and one right here, and this one uses this spindle-like thing here to help move the head back and forth. So with this one, now as you can see, the wire-like thing has kind of fallen off, or at least one of them has. You can see this one's missing a screw here. But basically, as this turns, it pulls this one here, and it would unravel the other one, pulling the head back. And if it goes in the opposite direction, it would pull the one at this end and unravel this, pulling this forward. So as this moves back and forth, the head moves back and forth. And being on a servo, it gives it a very, very fair amount of accuracy and precision to get the data exactly off the head. Now you can see the top little reader, so that little thing there is how the data's got, is a bit bent. But that's how, so this should technically glide across the hard drive, like that. Now, you can see here's the spindle, but with the newer hard drives, you can see that it uses a magnet. Now, this is a very, very powerful magnet, and this is a coil. So, what we know about basic magnets and coils is when you put a voltage or electricity in a coil, it creates a magnetic field, and two similar magnetic fields, so the north end of a magnet and a north end of a magnet will repel, and the south end of a magnet and a south end of a magnet will repel. So what they can do is they can apply different amounts of magnetic force, different amounts of voltage and a different polarity to change the intensity of the magnetic field. Not only that, but the polarity of it. So when they want the magnet to come close, they'll make it the opposite, and it'll come in. And if they want it to repel, they'll make it the same. So by using this magnetic field and the varying, they can get it precisely where it needs to be, which makes the head move. Now, if you also notice, one of the differences that helps put more data on the drive is the size. There we go. Is the size of the reader. So you can see that reader is kind of big, especially in today's terms. So that little black box thing there, which glides across the hard drive. And you can see that that same thing, it's not black, but that very little thing at the tip there is the reader and writer on this hard drive. And now even going to the laptop one, now the coil is hidden underneath this magnet. But here's the magnet, and if we can... no, you really can't see it. But again, hidden underneath this is the magnet that controls. And it makes this head move back and forth. And you can even see it has a little storage space there, so when the laptop is being transported in... when in its off position, the hard drive head has a place to be stored where it won't get dinged around and scratch the disk. And you can see here, right at the tip end there's the reader. So not only that, but the smaller they can make the hard drive reader and writer there head, the more data they can put on. Kind of makes sense. And also, the bigger they make the platter, the more data it can hold. So if you compare the two here, this platter is a lot bigger than this platter, so it can hold more data. Kind of makes sense. So with laptop hard drives, they don't hold as much, but they're a lot smaller because they need to fit in a smaller amount of space. Think how big a laptop is compared to a desktop. Now, you're probably wondering, how is it that when these hard drive, when these heads are reading, across the metal platters here, how do they not end up scratching the disk and wrecking it? Well, you got to remember, these hard drives are spinning so fast. I don't know about this old one because they changed the speeds at some point. But the more modern ones, depending on the quality of your drive, will either spin at 5,400 or 7,200 RPM. And if you really don't know, that's really, really, really fast. That's a couple hundred RPM per second. So they are spinning so fast that they actually create a little bit of lift, and the reader there literally starts to fly off the disk, and it gets close enough to store the magnetic data, to store and to read the magnetic data. Now, one of the other main things is, the closer they can get this head to hover without scratching the disk, the more they can more data they can put on here. And that's one of the other major things with hard drives and hard drive density. And when I mean hard drive density, I mean how much data the hard drive can store. So looking back at our old friend here, not only is it that the head can't, can't hover, not only can the head not hover as close as its modern counterparts, but the actual head that reads the data is much larger, so it takes up more room on the disk. It's kind of a whole density thing, total size divided by, reading size will give you about how big, how much you can hold, and there's a whole math behind it. So basically, closeness and size of the head determines, and the platters, but as you can see, the fact that the platters, change in size does have bits and pieces to do with it, but for like the hard drives here, the desktop one has bigger platters so it can store more data, but it takes up more size. But even though this has the biggest platter, the fact that the head is bigger and that it can't hover or float as close to the hard drive here means it has to take up a lot more room to store on the platters to store the data, so you can't store as much as opposed to its modern counterparts. And of course, they're always trying to make things smaller and sleeker. And if we pull down our example, and you can see this is what it looks like with it off and on. Same for its counterpart from the desktop end. You can see that this is even a newer laptop hard drive, and they try and make them smaller and sleeker and still be able to store a lot more data. And this one, it's hard to tell, but this one is a tad bit bigger than its more modern counterpart. And as you can see, the part of the thing that holds the platters is much smaller on the newer one, and the mechanism that controls the head on this one is much smaller. So by having smaller parts, they can make it much more compressed. And they can make it smaller, and due to some of the other things we talked about, like the head being able to float closer together, they can make it hold even more data. So in certain ways, by making it smaller, it can hold more data. In other ways, by making it larger, it can hold more data. So they basically, as hard drives progress, they make them smaller and be able to hold more data. So, like, as you can see, everything is a lot smaller and it holds a lot more. So, there you go. Everything you need to know about a hard drive, from the ancient ones all the way down to modern laptop hard drives. Thanks for watching, Internet.